Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and today I'm talking about the top 25 Dungeons and Dragons monsters. Now, this is not generic tabletop RPG monsters. This is specific to D&D, because some Wizards of the Coast owned properties will be on this list, and some generic monsters that you can use in your game will be on this list. And my cat wants to be in the video. There he is. Because I'm eating potato chips. And he thinks they're cat food. Number 25 is the Elemental. Elementals are creatures from the elemental planes that are pretty much an embodiment of that respective elemental. Now, I just put any elemental here on this list because they're all pretty cool. You got earth elementals, water elementals, wind elementals, fire elementals, lightning elementals if you want. Pretty cool. Now, for me, I prefer wind and fire elementals to others, but it's going to depend on your campaign. Elementals tend to be scary, but also not too incredibly difficult to overcome. And they're pretty iconic. Number 24 is the Giant. More specifically, the Hill Giant. But you can substitute Hill Giant for any other type of giant. Giants are a special class of creature in Dungeons and Dragons. And I think the Hill Giants are especially iconic. And any campaign that you play for any length of time should encounter a giant at some point. Number 23 is kind of like a giant, but it's not really. It's a giant version of a regular animal. This is the giant rat. Now, early on in your dungeon exploration, you should be fighting giant rats. I call them dungeon rats, but, these are your big beaver-sized rats. Your party should have a whole bunch of them, rat bodies, littering the dungeon. If you're playing the game right. Number 22 is kobolds. I think kobolds are underrated. A lot of people don't like kobolds for some reason. I think they're pretty cool. I think kobolds are good sword fodder. They're good for just plowing down monsters to get good experience at low levels. And they're very iconic. Number 21 is a monster you should use sparingly or only thematically. And it's dinosaurs. What I mean sparingly is you should only encounter like a dinosaur, maybe one adventure. Unless you're on a dinosaur-themed island or a dinosaur-themed jungle or a place where you would regularly encounter dinosaurs. Because dinosaurs should be, special, and rare. But dinosaurs are pretty cool. And it doesn't have to be a T-Rex. A Stegosaurus or an Ankylosaurus or a Triceratops could be scary in the right context. Number 20 is one I like to use. And back when I was a Chaos Witch, I regularly communed with in real life. And this is the Imp. I think imps are pretty cool as far as like inhabitants of the Nine Hells go. Imps are kind of very iconic. They're pretty much low level, but they're also like not low. They're not like lemurs, so they are useful in encounters. But they're not like so scary that the party's gonna shit their pants and run away in fear when they see an imp. Number 19 is probably the most generic fantasy role-playing game monster that you're ever going to encounter. And if your dungeon master's a dick, you are most likely going to encounter them your very first encounter when you walk outside the tavern. And probably 300 times throughout the adventure. It's the wolf. A pack of wolves is your base random encounter in Dungeons and Dragons. You pretty much run into wolves all the time. These are not werewolves. just regular old hairy dogs, wild dogs that live in the wilderness. Number 18, I haven't encountered too much in games as a player, but I always incorporate it as a dungeon master. I make sure there is an encounter with this creature because it's one of my favorite monsters. It's not really a monster, but in Dungeons & Dragons, everything that's not a player character is a monster. And this is the black bear. I think the black bear is one of the coolest creatures from Earth that exists in Dungeons & Dragons. So not your fairy tale creature or fantasy creature. Number 17 is the ghoul. Now, ghouls are... Well, when I say ghoul, I mean Dungeons & Dragons ghoul. I don't mean... shit. Dawn of the Dead ghoul, which is just another word for zombie. Ghouls are your, fairly low level undead, which is a good encounter if you have a paladin or a cleric in your party to test out their turn undead abilities on, as well as your barbarian and your fighter to, chop up with a sword. Ghouls aren't too scary, but they're also not too easy. That they should provide a challenge for a low-level party, but not like, boss level. Number 16 is actually a player character class, but I think it makes a great encounter as an enemy or as an NPC that you have to overcome. Usually with brute force, because they're not, by and large not very intelligent and not easily bribed. And this is the barbarian. I think it is really fun when you're wandering around the desert or an old temple or, an abandoned ghost town or village or whatever, and you just come across some buff-ass beefcake with a giant sword and a I'm gonna fuck you up attitude. That is an encounter that your players are itching to start rolling dice for. Number 15 is more of a boss encounter, but it's pretty iconic, pretty generic, but pretty standard. The Evil Wizard. The Evil Wizard is a powerful creature, usually level 7 or higher, if you want to make it a compelling boss fight. And it's full of the most terrifying spells that will really fuck up the party. The Evil Wizard is also good because, they just want power. They're just power hungry. Now, you could theoretically substitute wizard for either warlock or sorcerer, but nah, it's the Evil Wizard. You assume warlocks are evil by nature, and sorcerers are kind of on the fence. Because a sorcerer, to me, is just an evil wizard anyways. Oh, wow. Number 14 is kind of bland for some people, but I still think it makes a good encounter. Especially when you're coming into a walled city or, a caravan or just out in the wilderness and you get attacked. And this is just the general soldier or guard. I think these make good encounters. Because if they're low-level grunts, they can be bribed or reasoned with. Theoretically. But they also make good fights. Because it's a lot of hack and slash. And that's kind of what you want in some Dungeons & Dragons encounters. Number 13 is one I believe is exclusive to D&D, but don't quote me on this. I haven't done my research. But it is fairly iconic, mostly because it's pictured on the original monster manual from first edition AD&D. And it's the owl bear. I think the owl bear is one that is confusing to players because, every time I've ever seen an owl bear used in a Dungeons & Dragons game, the DM always describes it differently than the previous DMs do. So I don't know if anyone really understands what an owl bear even is. And I'm going to be honest, I don't either. I just like the name, and I think it's a cool encounter because it's kind of like, you know, a bear, but a little scarier. Number 12 is very common in Dungeons and Dragons, but it's one of those you have to have it, otherwise are you even playing D&D? And it's the goblin. You know, a horde of goblins in the basement, or, you know, at a village that was overrun by goblins and orcs, etc. You gotta have a goblin at some point. It's just very generic, but very basic, very iconic. Number 11, the Green Dragon. I mean, this is your Dungeons and Dragons dragon, you know? You're playing a game called Dungeons and Dragons. You gotta have a green dragon somewhere in your campaign. Whether a friendly dragon that you encounter to get advice from, or barter for a magical item or some sort, or, you know, it's terrorizing the village and you gotta slay it. But you should have a dragon in your game. And it should be a green dragon, because that's the iconic dragon. Number 10, very generic, very basic, you know, more so than even the goblin. It's the orc. I mean, if it doesn't have orcs, is it a fantasy game? I don't think so. You gotta have orcs. I mean, it's like you gotta have a cleric in your party. You gotta have an orc somewhere in the dungeon. You gotta have an orc. Orcs are just like the coolest fucking thing. Number 9, only a step level, probably 1 or 2 notches more on the cool scale than the orc, is the ogre. Now, what makes the ogre cool is it's kind of like a barbarian orc, but there's also the boss level ogre, the ogre mage, which can be terrifying, because you're talking about a barbarian with ogre strength and skills and intelligence that has magic. That's a scary fucking beast. Number 8 is the most generic undead you're going to encounter. It should be your first encounter in the dungeon, or at the gates of the dungeon, or at the cemetery outside the dungeon. You should be encountering skeletons all day long. Every, like, so many encounters should be an encounter with a skeleton or horde of skeletons. You got to give the cleric and the paladin something to use their undead ability on, and they're just easy. They're a half challenge rating. They're like 1 hit point. You just mow them down. Number 17 will show up in a lot of the same places as a skeleton, and is also a low level undead, but it's just a little bit scarier than a skeleton because it's a little deadlier than a skeleton and a little harder to kill, because they tend to come in hordes and can overpower you quickly. And this is the zombie. Especially if you want to play a horror themed or a very scary type Dungeons and Dragons game, or a scary encounter for that single night's play session, you really should have zombies in there somewhere. Number 6 is kind of an asterisk. I put down the werewolf, but you could substitute the werewolf for any lycanthrope. So were-rat or were-jackal or whatever suits your campaign. But if you really want to go like iconic, you want a werewolf in your game. Come on. Who doesn't want to slay a werewolf? Or befriend it and have it join the party for future shenanigans. Number 5 is my favorite villain type to play as a character, if it's allowed. A lot of dungeon masters don't allow it. It's also my favorite villain type in Dungeons and Dragons that isn't, I would say, exclusive or like tied to Dungeons and Dragons in a way. And it's the vampire. I love vampires. I think they make good boss fights. And they make good, interesting characters to negotiate with and to be terrified of. Number 4, I believe, was actually created for D&D by Gary Gygax, if I'm not mistaken. Although I could be mistaken, so don't quote me on this. Number 4 is the Lich. The Lich is basically an undead sorcerer or wizard, just a powerful magic being that happens to look like a skeleton. But it's very fucking scary. More iconic these days thanks to Vecna and Stranger Things, but the Lich is still, one of your core D&D monsters. Number 3 on the top 25 list of coolest D&D monsters is Demogorgon, like the Prince of the Abyss. I mean, the Demon Prince. The motherfucking two-headed monster that's gonna fuck you up. Now, Demogorgon should either be the final boss of your campaign, or have you ever played Final Fantasy VII and you have the Emerald weapon that's hiding in the side quest that you have to go defeat, but it's optional? Demogorgon should be an optional quest. Like, hey, Demogorgon's over here in a faraway country causing trouble. Maybe we should go investigate. And then, once your parties get to level like 12 or better, they can say, you know what? Yeah, sure, fine, why not? The number 2 coolest D&D monster is one of the coolest fantasy fairy tale creatures of all time. And it's the motherfucking Beholder. The Eye Tyrant. A giant head that is just teeth and eyes. Each eyeball does a different magical effect, which are really, really scary. And it has the anti-magic cone. And even if it doesn't want to hit you with its magic, it can just fucking rip your arm off with its teeth. Very cool motherfucker. Number 1, coolest Dungeons & Dragons monster of all time. This isn't debatable. The game is called Dungeons & Dragons. It's the Red Dragon. This is the one that shows up on the cover of all the books. When you're thinking Dungeons & Dragons dragon, you're thinking Red Dragon. And this is like the coolest motherfucker you're going to encounter. Now, the Red Dragon doesn't have to be, nor should it be, your final boss. But it should be one of your level bosses somewhere in the game somewhere. Because your players are itching to chop the head off of a dragon and cash in those dragon scales. You know what I mean? That's why we play the game. Stay cool.